Thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay. All right. We're going to get started again here. Our next talk is Sky High IR, IR at a cloud scale. Our next speaker, is that right?
Yeah. Aaron.
I know. I'm like flipping through my. No, I got it. I know. Our next speaker is a B-Sides Raleigh Durham alumni. He's been here a couple times, so we appreciate him coming out. Obviously, we wouldn't have asked him back if we didn't think he had a great talk. But Aaron is he's been in cybersecurity for 15 years, worked in a bunch of different organizations such as healthcare, federal government, software, energy, and defense industries. He specializes in managed security and assessment services, including managed detection and response, strategic and technical assessments and training. Aaron's also a graduate student at the SANS Institute. Aaron Lancaster.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate you guys coming out to hear my talk today, and thanks very much to the B-Sides organizers for having me back. Count it a privilege to speak to you guys today. And so, for those of you who don't know me, a little bit about myself. I am a senior security engineer at RM Source, a consulting firm here in Raleigh, as well as a master's student at SANS Technology Institute, STI, for some of you may know it. I also like to spend time with my family, try to put them first. And a little bit about myself, former Army helicopter pilot, 7 years there, also a number of other duties there. Generally, my day-to-day in cybersecurity looks like incident response, defending networks, assessing networks to find new vulnerabilities, as well as writing code to try to automate out routine processes. And I'm also into amateur radio as well. I do want to give you guys a little bit of overview of what I want to talk about today. So first and foremost, here we're going to talk about some strategic, tactical, and legal implications of conducting IR in public, private, and hybrid cloud environments. We're also going to talk about some industry trends and tools, some critical components, and crown jewels and how they might be compromised, and then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. I am going to provide a link to my slides, the recording, as well as some references for further reading at the end, so don't feel like you've got to burn up your battery taking pictures or whatever. All the slides and everything are going to be out there for your perusal later, and I'll have a link to that at the end of the presentation. I do have to make a disclaimer about this presentation, especially in light of some of the things that we've been talking about today. I'm going to present my point of view on some of these issues. They don't represent my employer's point of view, past, present, or future, and please do not take them as legal advice. You need to seek your own legal advice from your attorney or your company's attorney regarding how these issues might impact you and your company. So rule number one, I want to make sure to regard. I'm going to poll you guys real quick so I can get to know you. You've gotten to know me a little bit. So first and foremost, how many individual contributors or worker bees do we have out there? Guys doing the day-to-day grind either offensively or defensively or both? Okay, good. Next, I would like to know how many team leaders or Managers, maybe you would consider yourself to be in that category. All right. And then finally, well, not finally, but next up, I think would be maybe a group of people who doesn't fit in either one of those categories. But how many students do we have in the audience? Or maybe you're thinking about getting into InfoSec. Thank you for being here. This is one of the best opportunities. Let's give them a hand, the students, for being here. And then I was going to ask if there were any feds in the room, but we already know the answer to that, so we don't have to ask that question. All right, so no matter who you are, I think we expect a lot from the cloud, and that's kind of resulted in some, I think some misplaced expectations. Maybe it used to be easy to be a cloud, but it's a lot more difficult these days to be a cloud because we expect a lot from it, right? Technology has promised us a number of things, and we are expecting it to deliver, and I think that in tech we feel the pressure of that because as the implementers we feel the pressure to deliver on those promises as well. And I think one of the important things that we've got to realize is that sometimes those expectations can come back to bite us. BYTE. I apologize for bad jokes in advance. I'm a dad now, so according to Google, there's not much difference between dad jokes and bad jokes. I've already apologized for my bad jokes, but I think, one of the misplaced expectations we have about the cloud is that at the end of the day, the cloud is really just someone else's computer. And so that creates some problems for incident response, right? As we start to think about different cloud environments, whether it be public, private, or hybrid cloud environments, hybrid being a mix between private and public cloud environments, there are a number of different strategic and tactical obstacles that we have to overcome in order to be able to conduct IR, which we've been hearing about today, a number of excellent talks about incident response and forensics in different focus areas. And so I want to talk a little bit more about that from a broader perspective and kind of help bring some things together maybe from today. So toward that, I want to talk about the inspiration for this talk. So I actually attended a talk a few months ago that was given by a law enforcement officer, and they were talking about some of the challenges they have when they do investigations, which I don't think we had time to get into as we were hearing today from our panel about the ins and outs of what an investigation might look like, stepping through that entire process. That talk and hearing that, had a focus on coming into a business environment from an outside perspective and conducting their legal investigation within the four walls of that business, as it were. And so today what I want to talk about is forensics, but specifically as we're talking about the cloud, I want to be clear to say that we're talking about forensics and incident response on virtualized platforms. Typically, legal investigations involve short notice. So one of the things I think that was not touched on, with our panel today that I want to share from my experience is when you suddenly become involved in a legal investigation that you weren't planning on. So what this means is that you may receive some short notice that you have to produce some data. We're going to get into that in just a minute. But also that each of us has a legal, ethical, and self-preserving interest to comply with these investigations. But we also have to keep our customers' interest in best mind. And that could be individual customers or business customers. And so continuing to think on some of the things that we've been talking about today as far as the ethical implications of some of the legislation and policies that we're seeing change in recent days and years. So what this is usually, would come to you in the form of a subpoena, and that would be frequently received by your either by a CEO or someone in your company's legal office, someone who represents your company, and then make its way down to the information security department through the chain of command. But that would perhaps take a form that would look something like this. This is an example of a subpoena, and it spells out some things that I just want to point out real quick. I'll apologize for turning around because the view on my screen is really small, and I want to be able to point out some specific items. So I'll try to keep the audio good. But as you can see, that there's a deadline in the first paragraph. This one is redacted, but this goes towards the point that I was making on the previous slide about short notice. This could be as short as 14 days calendar. As well, there will be a point of contact, like a special agent who's working this particular case. Frequently, these are related to ongoing investigations into fraud related to something the government has prior knowledge about. So it could be a federal contract, it could be insider trading, it could be any number of issues where something has been reported to law enforcement, and then now your company, because of the services or either internal or external that you deliver, you now have become a part of this investigative process. In addition to this, there could be a subpoena to testify before, for example, a grand jury. So this could involve actual appearance, like was talked about earlier, where you personally, as the point of contact for the forensic investigation, come under questioning for the forensic process. So due diligence in that forensic process can become a critical thing. But in this particular document, the reason I wanted to have it up here was because you have a number of informational elements depicted front and center that are related to this case that the government may be looking for in order to substantiate a legal case in and of itself. So those things could be, for example, IP registration, history logs, addresses, upstream and downstream provider information, accounts, cookie data. It could be raw logs. It could be entire virtual machines. It could be an entire vhost. It really can run the gamut. And to add to this, what if I told you that you might not be able to talk about it individually or corporately? So these can be accompanied by a gag order, and this is something that would say you are not allowed to in any way make movements, do say anything that would tip off the subject of the investigation, or even your customer, who might not even be the subject of the investigation, that there is an investigation even going on. Give you a chance to read that real quick. So these can be non-time limited, historically speaking. And tangential to this is the national security letter, which would say this is an issue of national security, and you are now under a mum regarding this issue. Even if you never had a security clearance, never worked for the government, might not even be a citizen of the United States for that matter, but as being brought into the part of this investigation, you're now, your freedom of speech is restricted. So because of this, Microsoft decided to sue the Department of Justice in 2016, the end of 2016, because what they had encountered was that 2/3 of their 3,000, they had received over 3,000 gag orders between 2014 and early 2016, which resulted in the case at the end of 2016, where 2/3 of those had no end date whatsoever, and they basically went back and said, look, at some point in time, we should be able to tell our customers we had to give your data over to the Department of Justice for a federal investigation, and we want you to know. They felt an obligation to do that. Other companies, especially large public cloud providers, have followed suit. Microsoft, Amazon, Google Cloud, etc., Rackspace. And they're arguing against these Section 2705 Stored Communication Acts as a violation of the First Amendment. So a freedom of speech to be able to say, this is what happened and we feel that you need to know. So because of that, in 2017, the Department of Justice changed their policy, to the best of my knowledge, and from talking to others, that has stayed the case, and they changed their policy to be to require that appropriate factual basis for the case is demonstrated before the subpoena and gag order can be issued. They have to be limited to 1 year. And that policy is overall barring exceptional circumstances. Now, there's been some speculation that the Department of Justice would recant this policy in an extraordinary circumstance, but that hasn't happened yet. Again, this landscape is changing very rapidly, so becomes very difficult to determine what might happen in the case of maybe in a large-scale terrorist attack that became known in advance, or something like that. So I want to talk a little bit about IR process for maybe some who are not as familiar with that. So a standardized process for IR and organization. I'm going to go right out of the Incident Handlers Handbook, Patrick Krall, February 2012. This is available for download on the SANS reading room. I'll provide a link to that for you guys as well. And so the first step in that, as we've been talking about today, is to plan ahead, to have an incident response plan, one that's tested and is verified, and everybody is trained up on how to fill their role as a part of that incident response. The second part is to identify every host, every network, every database, everything that is involved as a part of the incident. So this gets into scoping. We're going to come back to this on the next slide. Containment, so containing that incident, and then for example, if it was an infection of some sort, keeping it from expanding. If it was a persistent threat, cordoning that off so the threat actors cannot pivot within the environment to other areas. With special care to not tip off the adversary that you're on to their actions. Next is eradication, so actually eliminating that. And we talked a little bit about that. We heard a little bit about that with the panel, and as our FBI agent indicated, a lot of times eradication, we think that we have done everything required to remove that threat and later find out that there's some other point of presence or some other issue where they've managed to wiggle their way back in. So remediation is the follow-on to that, so rebuilding systems, patching, closing holes, closing vulnerabilities, etc. And then what I think is even more important than potentially planning is the lessons learned phase. So we have to learn from our mistakes, learn from history, even if it wasn't our fault, and to move on with that knowledge, armed for to better protect the networks that we're entrusted with. So I want to talk about scoping the response here. So first and foremost, determining the scope of the investigation. So this could be, you know, something that's law enforcement driven. It could be something that's internally driven, either by management or legal or finance, what have you. So we got to determine what the scope of that is. Then determine what systems and data stores are involved in that investigation. And finally, gather the data needed to conduct our forensics. One of the major problems with this is that, tactical issues with this is that when you start talking about the scale of conducting a response like this and forensics of such, this can result in an enormous amount of data. So, you know, say for example, you have built this infrastructure in AWS, or you built this infrastructure in Azure, and you're going to conduct this investigation. You know, you might not be able to just go out there and simply download everything that you need in order to do this investigation. First and foremost is some of the cost associated with this. So as you may know, for those of you who don't, public cloud providers are going to charge you for transfers across the WAN, or across the wide area network, the internet. And that's typically going to take the form of a number of gigabytes per day, week, or month, and that'll be tiered based on what your current consumptions are. So, for example, if we look at Microsoft with Azure, you can see that for the first 5 gigabytes a month, there's really no cost within the zone. But for the next 5 to 10 in that month, you're going to pay a number of cents per gigabyte. So when we start talking about, say, for example, a full scope investigation where full data and full virtual machine images must be provided to a third party entity, and forensic investigation cannot be conducted in-house. That's going to be conducted by a law enforcement agency of some sort. You might be looking at something on the order of 14 terabytes. Okay, so your business is going to incur an immediate cost in supporting this investigation. That's something that you have to plan for in advance of an event like this. Similarly, with AWS, you're gonna also have data transfer fees, and they're on a similar scale. Not surprisingly, over 80% of the servers in AWS are Microsoft servers. So you could be on either, you know, pretty much agnostic of what type of infrastructure you're running, and potentially agnostic of what type of industry vertical you're in. So What we're really talking about is honing in on the devices, being storage, compute, and data transmission, the data and the destinations involved in doing this incident response. So one of the best ways to pare this down is to slice this data down to only what we need. So for example, we can ID exactly what's needed, just surgically remove that data, and then use compression if possible to reduce the bandwidth across the WAN. So again, leverage that relationship with law enforcement if it is an external investigation. They may not be able to say a lot of things about the case because they're operating on a need-to-know basis and they feel that you don't need to know. I found that it is best to present the challenges that you're faced with as the responder, but also I think generally, and this is generally a good rule for career in general, present a solution to that problem to them, something that's acceptable from a time, cost, and operational perspective that's going to allow you to be able to meet, to produce a win-win situation. So discuss those time, cost, and operational impacts. Ask them for what you want. One of the things that plays into this is that more investigations are increasingly becoming, it's becoming acceptable to only provide the needed data, files, emails, logs, etc., due to constraints. So you can get the exact requirements that the investigator may have by presenting your solution and saying, this is what I'm able to do. I'm not able to meet 14 days. It's going to take me 14 days just to move the data across the network between backup cycles or whatever it is. And then I can have it to you, by, say, day 18 or business day 15 or something like that. One way of navigating around this in the in-house investigation is to use IR-dedicated VPCs, for example, or virtual environments, a whole data center, if you will, in the VMware context, where a number of systems and accounts are pre-positioned but not consuming resources to use in the case of an incident response like this. So Jonathan Poling did a great talk at DFIR the last 2 years, SANS DFIR conferences. There'll be a link to that in my resources page for you guys to take a look at. He's specifically talking about Amazon S3 and how to run an IR in AWS. So in order to accomplish slicing data like this, if we are forced to move it across a WAN, is to use a tool that can retrieve that data directly from the public cloud environment or hybrid cloud environment. And one great way to do that is to leverage Python. So we can use a module that understands the existing structures, if there is one, depending on the environment. And if we need to, we can actually do byte-wise retrieval of that data and slice down to very granular levels. And that would look like determining what the data format is, what delimiters we can use, and then loading that data and saving it off for analysis with additional tools. There are other tools out there, for example, S3QL, which is really an additional file system that can be used to move data into almost a virtual file system for analysis. It supports things like encryption, compression, deduplication, snapshotting, dynamic sizing, immutable trees, and most importantly, supports a number of backends like Google, Amazon S3, and many others. So let's talk about some scenarios in supporting architecture. We're trying to move a large amount of data, ensuring reliability, and we need to verify integrity. So if I sit down and think about this, to me, that really sounds like a backup solution. Backup solutions have their own challenges, not the least of which is a forensically sound image. So if this type of thing were leading to an actual case, which sometimes you don't know if it is going to lead to an actual legal case, or if you just need to know what happens for the sake of getting back on your feet, then the backup solution may not be the tool of choice. But for rapid response, there are a lot of advantages, and one of the ways of approaching this is using a backup solution like Veeam to move data between hot, cold, or warm environments where you could then conduct analysis. From an attacker's perspective, this would look nothing more than a routine backup job. So that's another advantage of this area, is you're probably, if you're already using Veeam in a fashion like this, you're less likely to inform an attacker of your knowledge or of an instant response that's taking place. Veeam offers a backup solution called Veeam Backup Free. It has a number of really cool features to it. One of the best ones is the compression and the ability to be able to move full VMs, even off an array, all the guest files, and to be able to explore specific items. So say, for example, you know that what you're looking for was exchange-based. You're not really looking for everything else, all of the rest of your, logs from that server, all the rest of the data from that server. You just really want to hone in on Exchange specifically. This product provides viewers specifically, explorers specifically to these types of scopes. A part of that is a component called Veeam Fast SCP, and this is something that they brought from a standalone product into Veeam Backup Free, and it has a number of good features as well, and I think not the least of which is down towards the bottom here. It doesn't require you to put ESX into an unsupported mode. So you may find that a lot of investigative techniques or a lot of instant response techniques require you to put ESX into some sort of console mode that's not supported. It might make the system unstable or something like that. And this helps you to avoid that. Also, you're not creating an additional threat surface because no additional services are required. Paul Henry did, the author of SANS Forensics 508, I believe, did a great write-up on this type of technique, and I'll provide a link to that and the references for you guys to take a further look at. But I want to move into some industry trends and some tools specifically related to in-cloud forensics and offline forensic analysis. So one of the great tools that's out there, completely free, and some pretty big forensic experts in our industry have come out and said, look, if this cost $10,000, it would still be a steal. So if you're not aware of the SANS SIFT workstation as a forensic analysis and malware analysis platform, because it can be co-installed with Remnix, you should definitely take a look at that. There are a number of supported file systems, image types, and tools that are built in. Let you guys take a look at that real quick here. Really, this is the type of thing that you should have pre-positioned in that VPC environment. or in a dedicated data center on your vSphere, vHost, where you can spin it up and mount the drives that you need to take a look at right away. So this goes back to your planning phase, right? You're not just planning on paper, but you're actually building out these environments to be ready to go, because for the eventuality of having to deal with some sort of incident response. So now I want to talk about some critical components or crown jewels and some ways that they might be compromised. So attackers are after data where it's stored, transmitted, and processed, right? So all of those have different peculiarities that allow them to become more or less accessible. And so we'll talk about some specific areas related to this scenarios, without getting into the impact and severity of the actual those actual things themselves. So some of you may recall that ransomware, a technique of ransomware, especially early on, was to disable shadow volume copies. And you may recall that disabling shadow volume copies is one of the primary ways that System Restore and Microsoft and even a lot of backup solutions do incremental backups and restore. So one of the first vulnerabilities that we encounter is similar to that, and that is of what's referred to as a VMware repair install. This is basically installing over the VMware installation partition with a new install, remounting all of the virtual machines and data stores, and then taking advantage of what you have access to. This could be would definitely be referred to as a hostile acquisition. It requires physical access to the box, and it's going to seriously mess up your vHost, including your disconnecting storage area networks or network attached storage. Toward this, this has actually been done by competitors in customer premise equipment environments where the service provider didn't take adequate steps to lock the case, lock the BIOS, disable USB DVD drives, lock down the storage network, provide encryption for volumes, etc. So, and what do I mean by that? I mean, someone at the customer premise makes a decision that you're no longer their service provider and invites another service provider in to basically take over everything. Not exactly serving their company the best, nor serving themselves the best. So again, we're talking about where attacks can be perpetrated, where data is stored, transmitted, and processed. And some of the challenges, that can lead to this are the lack of logging or a failure to protect those logs on our part. So first and foremost, we've got to turn on logging where it's available. And then in many platforms, logging can be protected through multi-factor authentication to keep it from being deleted inadvertently. Say, for example, with a compromised password or a compromised token. And then also, there's a number of other things up here you guys can see, such as protecting against account lockouts, data corruption, data loss. And each one of these has a nuance for a public environment or a private environment, and a facility for each one of those. One of the biggest issues that I've heard repeated over and over again is a lack of object level or object access logging. So what changes are being made in a VPC, what changes are being made, what commits are being made to a Docker container. Each object as it's accessed and changed should be logged. And if objects that shouldn't be changed suddenly are becoming accessed and changed, that ought to alert you. Earlier today, I heard it mentioned that, unnoticed billing, is an issue. And the example that I heard is a little bit different than the example I'd like to pose to you right now. And that is, if you're spending $15,000 a month on cloud storage, for example, and you incur a bill for an additional $1,500, would you actually notice the difference? Maybe, maybe not. However, in Amazon S3, that's something that you can alert on, and additionally, you can actually alert on, and you can actually create events based on billing. So things like turning up, turning down machines or VPCs, etc. So overall, you need a cloud-centric logging and threat management solution that's going to help you to keep a very close eye on what's happening in these environments. So I want to talk about integrity quickly. This would be corrupting data stream by altering the data. That could be at the origin where that data is, such as persistence on that system, deleting log data or deleting metadata or changing metadata could be an example of that. In flight, so in transmission, that might involve a man in the middle or gratuitous ARP kind of situation or something like that. Or finally at the destination, and that would be facilitated by some sort of phishing or drive-by download kind of attack that would give an attacker access to the destination system and be able to corrupt the data at the destination. Next up would be availability. So disrupting the job, the transfer, or the availability of that information via some sort of vulnerability scan. Those of you who are familiar with vulnerability scanning on an enterprise scale will know that there is a very distinct possibility that if a vulnerability scan is configured incorrectly, it can result in some very severe performance issues, and so precautions have to be taken, especially during backup jobs, to not produce a negative impact. This could be denying service of an API that's being used to conduct the incident response, or even affecting critical infrastructure like knocking over a firewall or router. So finally, I'll leave you guys with this slide that I promised that has the references for you. So I promise this QR code is clean. And please go out and take a look at some of the references I've provided out there. And I think we have a few minutes for Q&A. So are there any questions? I know we covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate you guys being here today. You'll probably find me hanging around the SANS table talking to other students or prospective students. Please stop by, pick my brain if you like, and thanks again for being here and listening, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the day. Probably.